Interested in learning about wine, but not sure where to start? You're in the right place. Welcome to the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. I'm your host, Haley Bowman, and I'm so glad you're here. I'm a wine enthusiast turned wine educator and founder of the Seattle-based wine tasting business, Cork and Fizz. It is my goal to build your confidence in wine by making it approachable and lots of fun. You can expect to learn everything from how to describe your favorite wine to what to pair with dinner tonight, and so much more. Whether you're a casual wine sipper or a total cork dork like myself, this podcast is for you. So grab yourself a glass and let's dive in. Welcome back to the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. Today we will be continuing our France and French wine miniseries. It's almost over. I know, it's so sad, but we still have 2 episodes to go. So I've heard from plenty of people that when I was visiting Burgundy, I had to book a tour. It's not the same as in the US where there are just tons of wine. Well, there are tons of wineries, but they're not all open for tasting. Many of them don't need to do tastings or don't see the benefit of doing tastings because they sell all their wine to restaurants or have allocations. And so if I wanted to experience something other than just a big, huge winery, which I still recommend going to at least one of those, but if I wanted to check out a small winery, I needed to book a tour. So that is exactly what I did. It's actually the very first thing I did after we had lodging and transportation figured out. Like, you can literally look back in my emails and it's like, okay, got the flight. Okay, got the hotel. Okay, we got the train ride to Beaune, to Burgundy. And then you have this tour that I that I booked. That was like the next purchase. But the first place I looked was actually Airbnb. If you did not know this already, Airbnb has been offering experiences for quite some time. And this is where I find a lot of really amazing international experiences. Honestly, I did a food tour that I booked through here back in, God, when was that? That was when my husband and I visited Barcelona right after I graduated. So that probably would have been 2017-ish. And they've just continued to grow on there and have some amazing people. So I looked there first, and that's where I found Kim. Her tour sounded like exactly what I was looking for. We started by looking at maps so we could get a sense of the region, and then we'd head into the vineyards and taste at 3 small family domains, exactly what I was hoping for. And it was totally customizable based on what we were looking for. So I couldn't have been happier. I booked this tour and had this experience with Kim. And if you want to learn more about this tour experience, go check out episode 78. That is where I deep dive into that and what we did and everything I learned. Now, of course, I was overjoyed when Kim agreed to join me here on the podcast. She has been hosting tours in Burgundy since 1999 and just has so much information to share. So without further ado, let's get into the interview. Oh, how are you? Nice to see you again.
Good to see you. Very different context.
I know, right? Unfortunately, I'm not in Burgundy about to go on a tour drinking wine. I sure wish I was.
Get on over here, girl.
Sure, I'm missing out. Thank you. Thank you for joining me and agreeing to do this. I'm so excited to learn more and get to hear more about your story as well.
My pleasure.
I think it's always fun for you to introduce yourself. So can you tell us who you are and what you do?
So my name is Kim Gagne. I've been living in Burgundy for a good part of 34 years now. I started off in the wine trade working in California, which led me to Burgundy and has created many different aspects of my life in the wine world based here in Burgundy. So my main activities are running wine tours, which is how I met the wonderful person, Haley, that's interviewing me, and exporting wine as well to the United States.
Cool. I love it. Yes. I was so excited. Your tour was amazing and it was just so much fun and exactly what I was looking for. And Burgundy is so hard to figure out what to do. I'd love to know, one of the things I always like to ask people in the wine world is how they got into wine. I feel like it's one of those that like everyone has like their own unique way of finding, their job in the wine world and how they got into it. So can you kind of give us your story, your journey into the world of wine?
Sure. I fell into it. I laugh often saying that I fell into a wine vat, but it had never been a plan of mine, but I can almost imagine it was destiny, if one believes in destiny. I had gone to university in San Luis Obispo, which was definitely a rising wine region in California. And unbeknownst to me, there was actually a wine program that was getting started during the time I was at the university. And I'd always enjoyed wine, but didn't know about it, besides enjoying to drink a bit, etc. But after graduating from university, not knowing what I wanted to do, I traveled for a year, ended up coming back to San Luis Obispo and literally tried out a ton of different jobs, trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I answered an ad for being a PR director at a winery in San Luis Obispo in the appellation of Edna Valley Vineyard, or Edna Valley, and it was the winery Edna Valley Vineyard. And was very lucky at that point. It was a winery that was created by Richard Graff, who was one of the early pioneers, I would say, for California, understanding Burgundy wines. He had spent time here since the 1960s and created wineries in California very much based on that Burgundian style. And that's who happened, not Richard Graff himself, but Stephen Dooley, who is the winemaker at Edna Valley Vineyard, hired me, and I knew nothing. But I knew the second day on the job, it was the right place for me. And of course, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, which are famous for that region, and making it as much as one could in a very Burgundian style. So that led me to getting to know an importer we worked with, and based in the San Francisco area, that was importing some of the greatest domains, the wineries in Burgundy, in the Côte d'Or region. And I had always traveled, so I decided with a girlfriend to go off to Paris and live in Paris for a year and learn French and spend 4 or 5 days of my very limited budget in Burgundy to get to know these wineries that I was going to be repping in the Bay Area. And those 4 days from 1990 became my life because I'm still here 34 years later. Voila, that's in a nutshell.
I love that. I know you told that story on the tour where it's just hilarious. We're like, yeah, 4 days here, and then I just haven't gone home. I just started with that. I mean, obviously you've gone home, but
we'll keep it concise.
Yeah, exactly. But like, essentially, you were just like, yeah, I came, I loved it, I stayed. This was it. Just a quick reminder: if you are not on my mailing list yet, what are you waiting for? I would love for you to join. When you do, you'll get a free shopping guide that has 15 of my favorite wines under $15. Head to corkandfizz.com, scroll down to the bottom, and there'll be a little section where you can join the mailing list. I send out a weekly newsletter filled with wine tips, recommendations, special offers, and so much more. Now, let's get back to the show. So that was going to be my next question of like, what drew you to Burgundy? But it sounds like it was kind of the connection with the winery already. And like, yeah, what was it that made you think, okay, I like that we're making this in the Burgundian style. I actually want to go to Burgundy.
It was more, yes. And what was great is how my palate started developing with that style and with somebody who was so passionate and knowledgeable about Burgundy. It was certainly Californian, especially this was in the late 80s. You could not make a very Burgundian style there, but relatively it was. But I never imagined living here. Again, I came for the few days and it was to get to know the wines, but I was going to spend the rest of the year in Paris. But of course, in Paris, I only spoke English, and 4 days in Burgundy, the only thing you learn is that you know nothing and you need to spend a lot more time here. I always think about people like yourself, and at least you have the great wine background, but so many people who don't, and they come here and I'm throwing so much information at them and it's so complicated. You just can't understand it in a day or 4 days. So I decided to spend the rest of my year here, both that I would be forced to learn French and so that I could get to know the wines better. So I moved from Paris down to Burgundy, figured out a way to live here with no money, no visa, nothing, no infrastructure whatsoever. And I figured out a way to be here. So there was never the plan. And I was going back to the Bay Area to be a rep for this importer in the Bay Area. So it never had been a plan to stay. Definitely that second day on the job at Edna Valley Vineyard, I knew this was going to be a good part of my life. And yes, it's proven to be so. But it was one thing led to another. And of course, and everybody loves to hear this, but during that year that I was here, I ended up going to a wine school in Beaune that's very famous, the CFPPA, that a lot of people around the world come to. And I met a Frenchman, of course, which made me stay for many years. We won't
That
get
certainly
time.
helps. That's fair. That's fair. So, talking about the education and going to the school, is that your main form of learning about wine? Or how would you say that like you said, you went from knowing nothing, getting that PR job, to then, I mean,
Mhm.
obviously you're doing tours in Burgundy and know a ton. How would you say you've learned about wine over the years?
It's interesting. It's a good question. I've never thought about it in that sense, but it's an interesting parallel that I went to Cal Poly University, learn by doing. And that is truly, and I seriously never thought about that before, but that's how I learned about wine. It's how I learned French, living here and just being forced to communicate. So my French is still not perfect, far from it, but spending 34 years here in France and almost 3 years in California before that, and loving it, being so passionate about it and creating my life around it. It's learning by doing. The school helped me certainly with a lot of the basics, but I didn't speak French and the school was in French. So it was a little limited for me. Luckily, I had the background of wine already. So it's literally when I think back to some of my early tours, which I started in 99, I had been in tourism prior to that here in France. But when I think back to those tours, and people really loved them, but I think, God, I knew nothing compared to what I realized I do know today. But it's always more than people who haven't spent time here. And yeah, so it's been a very rich education over 34 years.
I love that. I think that's such a great point because I think in the wine world there is a lot of opportunity to learn without having to take like take a specific educational class. And like you said, it can give you the basics. It probably helps if it's in the language that you're familiar with.
Definitely.
But I've also like I tell people too, they're always like, "Well, how did you learn so much?" I'm like, "Most of it was just like diving in. I have one formal education certificate. Otherwise, it was just diving in and learning and reading and tasting and going to wineries and asking them questions and
Right,
the more
exactly.
you get into it, the more you can learn. And then you accept that you'll never know everything because you can't possibly, and you won't even know everything about Burgundy, let alone everything about wine.
Exactly. I'll often tell people we'll be sitting in a wine cellar and tasting wines. They say, you know so much. And I give them a very quick synopsis that, I thought I was going to learn about it in 4 or 5 days, but it's been 34 years. And I'll show them the floor to the height of the ceiling, the arch ceiling in the cellar. And I say, I've learned this much, but I've got 3 or 4 more lifetimes where I might learn it all,
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
10 lifetimes. It's a very complex area. So, and the great thing about it is it's exciting to learn. It's a lot of fun to learn, as you certainly know about. And so it's so interesting to keep learning. It's not finite with all the changes on our planet, with the weather, everything else, techniques changing. You constantly learn.
Yeah.
You're never bored.
No, exactly. I totally agree. So, going back to the tourism business, you said you started it in 1999. Were there any challenges that came out of being an American running this tourism industry in Burgundy?
Most definitely. The French do not make it easy for anybody to start a business here of any kind. It's a very, very tricky system. My French wasn't great either, but it was truly, and it's again how many things have happened in my life that it was a gentleman who was a big collector from Atlanta, Georgia, someone who was very, very dear to me. But I originally met him. He hired me with his friend who was an importer to translate for them. And I was actually, because I had been in the hiking and biking tour business, and I was going to move back to the States to live in Seattle, Washington, to run this hiking and biking tour business in Washington. And they hired me to translate for them, going to some of the best wineries here. So it was pretty darn exciting. Wineries that, unless you have people like that with their calling cards, you don't get into. And during that time, this gentleman said, Kim, you should really create a business. Nobody was doing wine tourism at that point. Very, very little. It was almost unheard of. And very shortly after that, I learned that the company I was going to work with in Seattle was sold. So I didn't have a job to go to. And so I started creating the wine tourism business. So again, it kind of fell into my lap. And this gentleman was very involved in the wine business in the States, including, if you know of the Chevalier de Tattevin. It's a big wine organization promoting Burgundy since the 1930s here. And he was a very important figure in that group in the US. And so he became my agent, if you will. bringing groups over. And that's how I started developing, because I mostly promote myself through word of mouth. So it was thanks to him that I was able to meet so many fabulous people and really get the tour business going.
Wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense for how you could find your way into that and at least get started. So was it primarily these people knowing the wineries they wanted to go to and you'd connect them, or were you able to even early on start working with some wineries to introduce people to?
It was more the first scenario, very different from what you and I were able to experience together. At that point in the late 90s and pretty much the decade of 2000 to the end of the millennium, these were big wine collectors. These were people more in their late 50s to their 80s who had amazing collections of wine. So they knew the wineries. I knew of the wineries, but at that point, those fabulous top tier wineries would accept visits from people that had collections. And especially because of this one gentleman who I'll name, some people might have known of him watching this, Bill Graves from Atlanta, Georgia. So he was the key to opening the door to these wineries. And because it was his friends who are also collectors, the wineries accept us to come and visit. They won't anymore. Even if Bill Graves was still with us today, with these same people, it's no longer feasible, but we'll talk about that later. So at that point, it was really who they wanted to see, yes. And thanks to Bill knowing these wineries and my being able to set it up, we were able to get into them. So
Okay.
very different world here today.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I think ties into the next question I was going to ask you about. I would love to hear your thoughts on how Burgundy and specifically kind of tourism in Burgundy has changed from when you first started the tours. I know we already mentioned that, like the style of your tours have definitely changed, but either that along with just the world of Burgundy, how has tourism industry changed since you started to now? This podcast is sponsored by Repour Wine Savers. Listen, I love wine, but that doesn't mean I want to drink a full bottle every night. You see, it's always a risk opening a bottle knowing I'll only have a glass or two. But now I don't worry about that at all because I have Repour. These little contraptions will keep your open bottles of wine good for up to 3 months by removing oxygen from the bottle using fancy chemistry. And they're so easy to use. I simply open a bottle of wine, cork or screw cap, just like normal, and enjoy my glass or two. Then, when I'm ready to call it a night, I rip the foil off my Repour wine saver and place it in the bottle in place of the cork or screw cap, and then stick the bottle in the fridge. Simple as that. Then, whenever I grab another glass from that bottle in the future, I just make sure to put the Repour back on as soon as I'm done pouring. It's that easy. Want to give Repour a try? Head to repour.com, repour.com, and use code CORK&FIZZ for 10% off your order. That's Repour, repour.com, and use code CORK&FIZZ. No spaces in that, and the and is spelt out, so it's CORKANDFIZZ. Once you have Repour, you'll never have to worry about opening a bottle of wine just for one glass. I mean, heck, now you can try 2 or more wines at the same time and have your own at-home wine tasting. This podcast is sponsored by the Cork Crew Virtual Wine Club. Interested in trying new wines, but not sure where to start? Or maybe you've been listening to this podcast for a while and you love the idea of tasting wine live with me. If that's you, come join my Cork Crew Virtual Wine Club, and you'll get to sip wine with me twice a month while I help you find new favorite wines. The Cork Crew is not your ordinary wine club. This is a community of people who are passionate about exploring new flavors, learning about different wine styles, and having fun along the way. And the best part about this club, purchasing the wine is completely optional. Plus, all events are recorded, and you have access to the full library of recordings as a Cork Crew member, so you can always catch up if you can't make it live. Oh, and did I mention it's virtual, which means you get to do all of this from the comfort of your sofa in your PJs. No need to worry about driving in crappy traffic, finding a designated driver, or spending an arm and a leg on a taxi. Want to give it a try without the commitment? You're in luck. Right now, I'm offering a free class pass to anybody who wants to try out the Cork Crew Virtual Wine Tasting Club. With this pass, you'll be able to join a cork crew event of your choosing. No strings attached. I don't need your credit card. I don't need you to sign up for anything. You'll be my guest. Simply head to corkandfizz.com/free class pass to get your class pass and be one step closer to becoming a member of the best wine tasting club around, the Cork Crew. I can't wait to see you there. Now let's get back to the show.
Dramatically. It's a different world. Yes, you can no longer get into those wineries, but it's really from that time that I started the tours, Burgundy was really starting to be discovered. Even though wine's been made here for 2,000 years, people didn't know about Burgundy. So it was a few of these collectors that had gotten involved, thanks to people like Bill Graves that these people knew, got involved with this brotherhood of the Knights of the Tasting Cup, which is the English translation, approximately. And so it was a very small niche of people, and very few people were even thinking about Burgundy. It was really about Bordeaux. Of course, Americans were very excited at this time to be going to Napa and Sonoma and discovering that. Oregon, of course. But Burgundy has really only become known to the level it is now in the last, I'd even say, 10, 15 years. So combined with that, global climate change has created very, very small harvests. So there's an exponential demand for Burgundy wine and people wanting to come visit Burgundy, but a greatly reduced supply of Burgundy wine. It's never become a business on an overall basis as it is in Napa and Sonoma and around the world, especially in the New World. Most wineries only have the family, the owners running it. A few of them are willing to take time and pour their wines. Most are not. A few wineries have been a little more business oriented and hired someone to accept visitors, but you must have an appointment. And they only want to open their doors if you're going to buy some wine from them, which, you go into a shoe store, you don't know you're going to buy a pair of shoes. You want to try them on. But of course, the salesperson really hopes you will, but it's not using any of their time or using any of their precious product to try on shoes. Wine, you have to pour it for them and give away something. So before it was really these great wineries, it was a very traditional thing where they would open their doors to give people a chance to get to know the wines. They had been written about, so people were willing to pay for them, but they didn't know them. So it was part of the culture. It was the mentality to allow people to get to know the wines. These days, very few wineries need that. They can sell 10 times more wine than what they produce. So why should they open their doors, take their time and pour you wine if they have no wine to sell you?
Right.
Or if you're going to come in and not buy any wine from them. So it's become a very different place. Many of the larger companies have created places that are open for the public. It's, of course, not where I would want to take people because I want people to have a very authentic experience of knowing the small family wineries. But luckily, there are other places that are open so people can get in and taste some wine. It's a tricky situation because there are fewer and fewer wineries that are willing to open their doors. And I tell some people that maybe in 10, 20 years from now, it's the only places you can go are the larger places open for large-scale tourism. They tend not to have the best wines. They tend to charge you a bit more, and you're not having a unique experience. So I'm glad you got to come when you did.
Me too. No, I'm very glad. And I definitely felt that during, because when we took our trip, we went to Burgundy, but we also went over to Nantes and we're hoping to do some tasting, some Muscadet tasting. And our friend that lives over there, he had such a hard time trying to find a winery that would take us.
For the Muscadet.
Yeah. And I guess because it was like harvest season, nobody, to be fair, let me add, I'm forgetting the other point.
Yeah.
We were there Monday and Tuesday.
Mm-hmm.
So it was also off days during harvest season. And because, like you said, most of these places don't really have a tasting room. They don't have a regular person working just to do tastings. The one place we went to was a place that looked like they'd invested some time and some money into having a little bit more of a tasting room and having somebody who specifically did tastings. Like that was her job within the winery. Otherwise, it was so hard because, yeah, like they don't. It's mainly the family, working, or they have like very few people working and they're in harvest during that time. And they also don't necessarily need to sell the wine as much. I'm sure Muscadet a little more, it's a little less known, but they sell to so many restaurants, as I'm sure Burgundy does as well.
Well, in 2 points. One on that note is that most family wineries in France are very small production. We talk about boutique wineries in California making 10 to 12,000 cases of 12-pack cases. A very typical size family winery in Burgundy makes 30 to 50,000 bottles because we only talk in bottles here. So they don't need the marketing to sell the large quantities like wineries in California and the New World would. One thing I want to point out, because this is good for people wanting to come to Burgundy, Mondays and Tuesdays are not the days off. Saturdays and Sundays, and especially Sundays. This is France. And Sunday it's the family day, except for a few and very few big tourist-oriented wineries are not going to open their doors. And many people would only open their doors on Saturday morning, and some neither Saturday or Sunday. So for good wine tasting in Burgundy, it has to be during the week. And for most family wineries throughout France, it'd be Monday through Friday. And office hours and not lunch hours. Very religious, we might be able to say as well for the French. You do not go tasting during lunch.
You eat during lunch.
You eat lunch.
Yes. I love it. No, I was definitely warned that. Our friend too mentioned he's just like, yeah, Sundays, don't expect much to be open. Don't, like not even like some grocery stores even close. Like it's just not a day that people go out. So it was very interesting, which is also why like again, just pointing out like work with somebody in France if you're wanting to go visit doing those tours. It's so much easier to work with somebody than we did try to book tastings ourselves in like Jura, and it worked out, but it wasn't the same experience because like you said, it was limited to who would accept us and who was interested in doing these,
Right.
big tastings. But okay, so I think it's kind of cool. I felt like this would be a fun question. As a tour guide, you probably meet wine lovers from all around the world. I know for our tasting, we were Americans and then the other couple were German. And you'd had Japanese tourists before that. And so you meet all different kinds of people at all different ages. And I was curious if you noticed any trends between like different generations or even folks from different countries on what they focused on in the wine world or how they saw Burgundy and when they visited.
Definitely differences. I would say it's almost more of eras. When I was referring to my original tours, it was a much older generation that had already been buying wine from California around the world, the well-to-do that were excited about getting to know Burgundy. And Burgundy has never been an inexpensive wine. So there were people that could afford it. At that time period, people like yourselves and the majority of my clientele now are actually your age group. They're young. And it really started maybe 10 years ago that I saw the huge shift of not the older generation wine collectors, and I'd say even 15 years ago. And it corresponds, of course, to that time period that Burgundy started becoming more known, but that the young generation has been very successful and is very curious and interested and wants to learn. Whereas the older generation and those collectors, they were lovely people and definitely wanted to learn, but it was more sort of clicking the boxes because they knew of the wineries. They had the wines in their cellars, but for them to actually go and meet these winemakers, that was the goal. Most of at least my clientele now wants to learn about wine and wants to learn about Burgundy. And as you cannot get into those great wineries anymore, and why I'm doing such different style tours, I love teaching people and being able to get them into tastings visits that are still accessible. Whereas people that have a lot of money and say, oh, we want to go to these great domains, well, you can't go anymore. So they're asking for things and they'll say, well, we'll spend the money to go. Well, the wineries don't care about the money. They're not going to pour wine. They could, and they don't need your money. I mean, everybody needs money, but it's not a business for them. So at this point, at least in my perspective and what I experience, it's about people that are so excited to want to learn and learn the base of it. The other folks did too, but I'll find, and if we talk just about now, the majority of people I have are mid-20s to mid-40s, maybe up to 50 is the majority of my clientele. I do, of course, work through Airbnb. My word of mouth business tends to be a little bit older, but through Airbnb, of course, I've met so many wonderful people that they tell their friends directly about me, which is fabulous. But yeah, it's more about people really wanting to learn and not having prior based demands. They don't know of the wineries. They might have heard of a few of the star wineries, but they know they can't get in there. And most people want to buy wine. They have the means to be able to purchase wines. It's a great option or opportunity to be able to buy wines you know you've tasted and liked, as opposed to spending a lot of money for Burgundy in a store. And it's a gamble. You never know, as I'm
Yeah.
sure you've experienced.
Yes, yes,
We all
absolutely. Absolutely.
always a gamble. So it's very much that. But I'd say the different generations, the young people are younger generations, are more open for learning and purchasing. Whereas more my generation, I would say, is wanting to learn a bit, wants the experience, but it's perhaps not as much about the learning, and they don't always have as much of the means because there's sort of a gap. There was that group before of the big collectors and willing to spend lots of money. But the next generation, I mean, it's certainly there, is not spending the money in that sense. And it's probably due to the different eras we've had. And this younger generation that is so excited, and Burgundy is known now, for the most part, known of it, that they're so excited that they get to experience it. Whereas my generation, we didn't know about Burgundy, and so many people didn't have the means to buy the wines.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I think that highlights such a great point too, because I think in the wine world, we talk about all the time that like, oh, the younger generations, like the millennials aren't as into wine as, the older generations. And I think that's just like totally discounts. It's just like, no, that's
No
not
way.
true. And we've
Not
got
from what I'm seeing.
got millennials interested in learning more and interested in buying, right? So it's like, it's not that the millennials, and I think it also highlights too something that I've noticed is like, yeah, people around my age and a little older are interested in like, they want to visit those small wineries. They want to like really almost like immerse themselves in this experience and know the story behind the bottles. And that's
Right.
what like intrigues them and makes them and I think that's why like some wineries are calling out that like, oh, millennials aren't interested. And they're like, no, they're just not interested in how you're marketing right now because that's
Right.
not
It's not
interesting to
about
them.
marketing. It's about having an authentic experience and really learning the quality and having the knowledge behind it. Whereas again, I could say that my generation, we grew up in a different era, and it wasn't so much about really understanding and knowing the quality of things. I mean, I don't want to generalize that much. There's, mix
Yeah.
in both groups, but definitely from what I'm seeing on my wine tours, it's been the case.
Interesting. And I think it showed up too. It was very interesting when you're talking about how, like, yeah, at first Americans didn't really know of Burgundy, nothing like that. And then the place where my husband and I, when we went out to eat every night, the place that had the most Americans speaking English was in Beaune in Burgundy at one of the restaurants. Like every table around us was speaking American English.
Well, Beaune is the wine capital of Burgundy. It is the place people come to. A few people stay in Dijon, but you really feel removed from the wine world when you're in Dijon. So Burgundy is the spot, and there's plenty of infrastructure between the Airbnb apartments and the other vacation rentals and the hotels and the bed and breakfasts. There's such a great infrastructure for coming and visiting the area from here.
Yeah. I have to highlight I had a friend who went to the school in Dijon, one of the schools, there's probably multiple, one of the business schools. And I had asked him too, because that was when I was planning the trip. And I was like, where should I stay? Like Burgundy, there are plenty of places where you can stay. And he's like, well, Dijon is great. I loved it, but it's not where you want to be if you want to be surrounded by wine. And you pointed us to Beaune. So shout out to, to him for pointing us in the right direction. Because you're right. It was like, Beaune was so fun we were just outside of Beaune, technically, where we were staying at the bed and breakfast, but you did feel surrounded by wine the entire time, and it was so cool. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. If you are taking a trip to Burgundy, I mean, if I haven't convinced you yet, come on. But if you are planning a trip, or maybe you did a Google search and this podcast came up and that's exactly why you're listening to it, which, like, perfect, glad you found this. But if you're taking a trip to Burgundy, a tour with Kim is an absolute must. We booked through Airbnb, but you have the benefit of booking directly with Kim. So you can contact her at kim@journeysandwine.com. It's a better deal. You'll get way more interaction and customization that way. So again, contact Kim directly if you're heading to Burgundy, you need a tour. It's kim@journeysinwine.com. If you love this episode as much as I did, I would so appreciate it if you could just take a quick second, rate it, leave a review, and share it with a friend. If you know anybody who thinks wine is cool or is looking for a new hobby or is interested in travel, this would be a great podcast to share with them. In next week's episode, you'll hear part 2 of my conversation with Kim. We'll learn more about how she chooses the wineries she visits and what she sees for Burgundy in the future. Thanks again for listening, and if you want to learn more about wine, be sure to come follow me at Cork and Fizz on Instagram. And if you're interested in exploring new wines and joining an incredible community of wine lovers, be sure to sign up for my virtual tasting club, The Cork Crew. You can actually experience your very first tasting with us for free, no credit cards required. Just go to corkandfizz.com/free class pass. I have a feeling once you try it, you're going to love it, but you get to try it out for free. There's nothing to lose here. Cheers.